Thank you all for joining. This is the first panel of the day, and to some extent, it's an emotional panel as well as a very thoughtful one. All of us in this room are the beneficiaries of globalization, I believe, and I think it is so important to the world that we reverse this trend of anti-globalization. How many of you are either citizens or permanent residents of Hong Kong? Thank you. I have been paying taxes in this city for more than 30 years, and I'm proud to be a permanent resident of Hong Kong as well. Even though I don't speak Cantonese after all these years. I want to particularly thank Regina Tasha Tsui Lihai Daran. All of us here are working to reverse this trend of anti-globalization, and no one is doing more to represent Hong Kong than Regina. So, Han Gan Chia Ni, on behalf of all of us. I will give you a brief roadmap, and then we'll start the discussion. I'm going to start with Iñaki to talk about the big macro picture. You know, what did we do wrong? Where did globalization go wrong? Was the reaction inevitable? And is it reversible? I am then going to turn to Eric. I first met Eric many, many years ago, and he was one of the most prescient investors I know who really saw how China was moving value added. And in a world where everything is dual-use technology, which has military and civilian elements to it, perhaps it was inevitable, however sad, that the US, which thought of itself as having a monopoly on technology, would raise alarms about China, however rightly or wrongly, and how Eric sees technology in China, where it surpassed the US, where it's closing the gap with the US, etc. And I'm going to ask him as a present, before we hear from Dr. Kornberg, about some of the areas where he's investing. For example, synthetic biology. I'm going to turn to Professor Xu. Before I turn to Professor Xu, I'm going to ask Professor Hanke to talk about the paradox that I see in the US, which no longer stands for free trade and has become rather populist and very protectionist in the name of resilience. And then I'm going to end with Professor Xu and how did China, and especially Hong Kong, navigate this world. But I'm going to ask the audience one question before I turn to you, Iñaki, and that is, how many of you feel that anti-globalization is reversible? Raise your hand if you think it's reversible. How many of you think it's irreversible, that we will never return to the globalized world? Thank you. What's your answer to the question? In our chat, you described this world as dangerous and populist.
Yeah, I think it's one of the cycles in history. I think we are going through a cycle, and I believe that, we will basically see this. I'm one of those that believe that we will see some sort of going back to globalization in one way or another at some point. I think the globalization that we lived probably will not come back in the same way, because that globalization lived under the premise that there would be always somebody that has the power to define for others how they would be helping and supporting their development. And I think what we have seen is that as those that are basically utilized to support those with power, as they develop, they also have aspirations. And those aspirations cannot be forgotten, cannot be unseen. you need to develop a mechanism, a system for allowing those that have aspirations to continue in that evolution. And sooner or later, they will need to basically there will need to be a matching game where you are able to understand that everybody needs to start performing under certain rules that allows everyone to really collaborate and be living in a sustainable environment. I think that we are moving into a world where everyone is trying to move production into the cheapest possible region in the world. And today, probably that's ending in Africa. But what happens when Africa is having those aspirations that we have seen passing from one region to another? I think probably the answer will be technological development. I mean, when we start seeing that machines are able to do a lot of the intensive labor force work that is actually now being handed over to lower and cheaper production centers, we will probably see a moment where humanity will need to start addressing how we are going to be able to coexist with that technological development.
I have not spent much time introducing everyone, but as you all know, Iñaki represents the European Chamber of Commerce. Now, I want to ask you something. Should we talk about countries, or should we talk about the interests of governments and companies? In this world, we need cooperation from both. Do you see them, companies and governments, as aligned or not? Because I often think that governments are the ones that are responding to, representing, advocating in many ways, populism. And companies are more, we want to sell to the whole world, we want to produce for the whole world. But yet, as you say, it's all about lowest cost. How do we have a more healthy dialogue, and how do you navigate in your own role as advocate with governments and the companies that you represent?
I think it's a very synergetic relationship in the sense that that image that companies tend to just focus on selling and profitability of shareholders, that has changed quite a lot in the last decade. I think that today, organizations and companies, private sector, are a lot more scrutinized by stakeholders that look at what are the different impact that the impact that the organizations are bringing into the social, into the community, into the environment. And that scrutiny is actually making organizations to be a lot more running at the forefront in some cases for helping the governments to define regulation. Here in Hong Kong, we actually, the European Chamber and the European organizations, we've been trying to bring in best practices from the organizations we represent in Europe, where we are actually many times leading in terms of technology around environment, many times leading around the way that we self-regulate and the way that the European Union has been regulating. We are trying to bring that best practice to this part of the world. And that means that we need to have a dialogue, a conversation with the government about what we think is in the best interest of the community.
How do you create that incentive structure? Can you give maybe an example of a challenge and what you're doing in this very polarized world to create the right incentive structures to align governments and companies to think longer term, when both of them have an incentive, whether it's electoral cycles or short-term profitability, to maximize short-term in a world that needs to think longer term?
So I think when we talk about environmental sustainability, it's probably one of those areas where it is easier to actually discuss long-term cycles beyond the elective cycles that happen in most of the countries in the world. But one of the things that we're starting to see is that also at the corporate level, there is a need for shifting the focus from the short term, which is typically the objectives of the CEOs and the leadership team, that they tend to focus on the quarterly results, the annual results. And that shift needs to happen at the board level. So the board of the organization is the one that probably needs to start looking into what is the long-term vision in a world where there are several threats that can impact the long-term viability of the company. So those are today, obviously, climate change, but more and more is going to be the influence of new technologies like artificial intelligence, and how it's regulated is something that is in our interest and is also interest of the public sector, that we actually have well-defined railways that are helping us to understand where is the limitation of that we want to impose into private organizations and for the consumers.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to turn to Eric. In our conversation, you talked about the need for carrots and sticks, and you talked about some of the things that the Spanish government is doing. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes.
Because it's absolutely critical that the private and the public sector work together going forward.
Yes, and we talk a little bit about the fact that, I mean, today is very important to understand that if you want to have a good alignment between the two sectors moving forward, you need to put incentives to facilitate that organizations are able to take advantage of the opportunities that are set for them, and also thinking a little bit about what is happening at the moment in Spain, where you have organizations that are trying to relocate into different parts of the country, where you have the organizations that are trying to think whether it makes sense or not to invest in certain industries or not. You need to start thinking about what are the mechanisms that you put in place in order to facilitate that. And most of the time you think about things like sticks like tariffs and sticks like trade barriers. But what we are seeing at the moment is that those do not necessarily always work. And you need to think a little bit about other mechanisms that incentivize, like, for example, allowing for giving incentives in the form of bringing giving a sponsorship for allowing different types of segments of the population to start working. We are seeing a bit of a problem with young youth unemployment, which is about 25% in the case of Spain, and then you have also a little bit problem with unemployment with the eldest part of the population. So in introducing incentives to bring these people into companies as a carrot is actually something that we're starting to see that is starting to happen. Maybe that's something that could be also introduced in some cases. Here in Hong Kong, we're starting to see the need for attracting talent, and I think it would be quite interesting to think how we can incentivize bringing more diversity into Hong Kong by measures like this one.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to go from the very macro now to the more micro, and I am going to ask Eric to talk about how he's navigating this world where dual-use technology means that the U.S. is feeling quite threatened by China, and how he sees the gap between U.S. and China on a whole range of technologies, and how he is deploying his capital in this world now compared to before. And it's my belief that the private markets in China have huge opportunities. So at the end, I'm going to ask him to be very specific and talk about Chengwei in this world where I think private markets in China are hugely interesting. But Eric, over to you.
I'm not going to give you my trade secrets.
I'll try on behalf of the audience, both investing and exiting.
Yeah. Okay, well, so this dual-use business is really a not very useful concept. You know, I mean, it's totally arbitrary. Everything can be dual-use. I mean, toilet papers can be dual-use. So
we don't want to think about that.
It's not a useful concept. So let's come back to talk about technology and what China is doing in technology. China's current push to raise the technology content in its economy, I think is mostly, if not completely, driven by China's own needs for the next stage of its development. It's being perceived as a rivalry with the U.S., but it's driven.
Especially by the U.S. Yes.
That which is understandable. Okay, but look, I mean, we got a huge economy, the largest in the world, but if we need to raise the per capita income of Chinese people by a notch or two, maybe 3 notches in the next generation or two. Okay, I mean, our per capita income is still low relative to many other countries, although our economy is huge. We simply cannot do that without substantially increasing the technological value add in our economy. It's just not possible. Okay, let me give you an example. Okay, so our industrial capacity is the largest in the world. We're the biggest industrial country in the world. About 35% of the world's industrial output. Our industrial capacity is bigger than the US, Germany, Japan put together. Okay, and my research assistant just told me last quarter, the numbers have moved, so our industrial capacity is bigger than US, Germany, Japan, and India put together. Okay, so it's huge. It cannot get any bigger. But the value add of that industrial capacity is still relatively low, about 12%, I think. It's like a gross margin of our industrial capacity. Okay? If you look at the US in the 1960s and 70s, when America was at the height of industrial power, their gross margin, their value add was 30, 40%. Okay? And the industrial capacity is worth about 5 to 10 trillion US dollars. That's huge, bigger than all countries. Okay? So it's that 30 percentage point gap in value add on a denominator of 5 to 10 trillion US dollars. That's the money we must go make if we are to raise our per capita income by a couple of notches in the next generation. We simply cannot do that without making that money. Okay? And that's on existing industrial capacity. But also there are new industries that are being led by technology innovation on day one, like alternative energy. Okay? So China is doing well, is leading the trends.
Can I just interrupt you there, because that's
Yes.
such an interesting point. You know, if you look at where China has clear leadership, it's in robotics and the optimal combination of labor and capital. So I think that demographics is actually less of a concern than many other people do, and I wondered if you could address that.
It's possible. It's possible. Okay. So yeah, but demographic is an issue. We have a gap where we're going to have too many people retiring and not enough people working in about 20 years from now. But 20 years from now, who knows what it look like? Okay. So
Are you investing in robotics
we have
and
robotics,
smart manufacturing?
Yeah, exactly. So what we're investing in are technologies, what I call technology-enabled industrial capacity. Okay. So to raise the level, you know, I like to use the iPhone story. Okay. So when Apple began to make iPhones, all the iPhones are made in China, 100%. Right? I had this conversation with a U.S. Official one time. This is a digression. Okay, a couple of years ago when we had this flare-up over Taiwan. Okay, and he said, you know, if you guys make a move on Taiwan, we'll have enormous sanctions, huge sanctions. And my answer is, who will be sanctioning whom? You know, if you sanction China, I go back to use iPhone 10. I was happy with it 5 years ago. But if we sanction you, you won't have iPhones at all. Just a joke. Okay. So when U.S. began to use iPhones, make iPhones in China 10 years ago, it's a $1,000 product. We kept 3.5% in China. Okay. Today, the number is up to 26%. Enormous progress. Okay. I mean, if we made the chip in there, it would be 60% or 70%. We don't, unfortunately. Maybe we will one day, okay? So we need to repeat the iPhone story in every sector. That's what China needs to do. To raise, again, the goal is to raise our per capita income by a couple of notches in the next generation. That's all we're after. Now, the US perceives that as a threat, understandably. I mean, I think the United States had made tremendous amount of money in the last 20, 30 years through globalization, especially in this relationship with China, okay? But it didn't distribute that money equitably inside America. It didn't invest well inside America. That's why it's finding it difficult to compete and win based on current rules. So that's what this de-globalization trend is happening, and it's reality. We have to deal with that. But China is doing all this technology stuff, for its own needs.
You made a very important point earlier, saying that China is developing technology for its own needs. One of the interesting things that you said in our conversation as we were preparing for this panel, I asked you whether government was chilling private innovation, and you said absolutely not. And we talked about the fact that actually the US and the Department of Defense were the catalyst for developing technology in the US itself. Could you talk about the fact that people have maybe this artificial distinction between the government and private sector innovation, and how you see the government and innovation, working hand in hand?
Yeah, so this dichotomy between state and market, and somehow they are opposed to each other in technology, that's fraud. It's just fraud. It didn't happen this way. Okay, so it so happened in the last 20-some years, our big techs are mostly in consumer-oriented platforms, right? Social media, e-commerce. Now, those kind of business models, the government had very little to do with, okay? But that's an anomaly. If you look at hard tech, real technology development, the state had always played a leading role because it needs investments, it needs far-sightedness. I mean, I'm a private investor, I'm a venture capitalist. I know, we're short-sighted, okay? Let's not fool ourselves, okay? We're into short-term profits, okay? We're not gonna make the kind of investment that's gonna generate, TSMC, for instance, okay? When I was graduating from Stanford Business School many years ago, many years ago, okay? At that time, Morris Chan came and gave a talk, and we were all steeped in neoliberal doctrines at that time. We were all laughing at him. We were all saying TSMC was a stupid investment. It was government-led, state-sponsored, low return on capital, asset-heavy. The smart people are in Silicon Valley doing fabulous design. And look at TSMC now. But no private investor would have done that. Okay. And Silicon Valley, of course, if you go to Silicon Valley in the 1970s, the state played a huge positive role in the development of Silicon Valley and internet, as Elon Musk, who his biggest patron is.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute,
Yeah.
tell you a story, and then I'm turning to another investor to pick up on your point that private sector venture capital is too short term. I was talking to the woman who runs the investment arm of Economic Development Board in Singapore. Singapore was one of the earliest investors in Moderna, way before COVID, because the Singapore government wants to diversify its economy and had identified biotech as an area where Singapore should develop away from real estate and financial services. Kin, do you think that Hong Kong should use its $500 billion in reserves to do more long-term backing of innovation? Kin Chan is one of Hong Kong's locals. I want the voice of Hong Kong, and an investor who has done so much to help this city globalize. Quickly.
I want to highlight the risk of being seated next to the moderator. And also expressing admiration for some of the panelists, like Eric. Thank you for coming back again to Hong Kong. What you said at FCC, fantastic. You come here so often, why don't you just move here? And Professor Hanke, I told Henny how much I have been following you since the Indonesian crisis, and as an Indonesia investor, I am so honored that I'm virtually in the same room with you today. Enough of the risks. I'm unprepared for this question, so I'm going to be speaking probably without much regard of personal risks. I was or may still be as steeped in liberal capitalist progressive ideas as Eric was 2 years ago at Stanford. I do not, even though I'm a part-time Singaporean, meaning I do Southeast Asia, I go to Singapore all the time, I do not really believe that you hire a bunch of people who scored very highly in public examinations and they will become good investors. And they may not even be very good custodians of hard-earned capital accumulated by the collective population. But having said that, GIC has done very well, obviously, compares very well with the peers. Stop me, I may be speaking too long. I am not sure we can replicate that. I know Regina disagrees with me because I've had this discussion with her before. I'm not optimistic that Hong Kong can replicate that. I think we should rely on private sector. And I think we should attract talents from all over the world who are specialists as opposed to a government-led.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So, Eric, one final question to you, and then we're turning to Professor Hanke. And that is, can you talk to us about the areas, very briefly, where you're deploying your capital?
So back to my earlier remarks. So that I think basically the Chinese economy is in transition, moving away from the old drivers of our growth in the last 20, 30 years, real estate, consumer internet platforms, and lower-end manufacturing, towards more technology-led growth. And what are these new technology-led growth? One is technology-enabled industrial capacity, and that's, like you said, manufacturing technology, robotics, AI manufacturing, image capturing, all these things that happen in the industrial process, okay? Supply chain technology, for instance, that's we're active in that. China has world's largest supply chains. Textile, for instance, 93-94% of the world's textile is made in China. Huge supply chain in China, highly inefficient, needs to be updated, digitized, okay? Semiconductor, without, you don't have to say why, it's a huge.
2 more minutes.
Okay, and life sciences and synthetic biology. 2 more seconds.
Thank you. That's great. I now turn to Professor Hanke as his awesome, odd interlocutor. When we were preparing for this panel, we talked about what has happened to the U.S. and how it has come to stand for very different things today than in the past. Once the U.S. was the forerunner of free trade, and now it's all about protectionism, populism, misallocation of capital. Professor Hanke, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you, Henny. Great to be with you and Regina and all the rest of you, even if it's virtual. I think kind of leading into that, I'm listening and thinking about Hong Kong, and I was thinking about it earlier this evening, and I noted that we're talking about global prosperity, and exhibit 1 for me would be Hong Kong, and I'm holding in my hand here a book, Architect of Prosperity, Sir John Copperthwaite, and the Making of Hong Kong. It's a wonderful book, and it reminded me, in thinking about this, of the years that I was with Reagan and Reaganomics. And there are 5 pillars of prosperity, not only in the book Making Prosperity about Hong Kong, but Reaganomics. And those are: 1, light taxes; 2, small government; 3, stable money. Of course, you have that with the Currency Board, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. 4, smart, light regulation. And 5, the thing we're focused on now, free trade. That's it. So thinking about what's going on now, we have, right now, when we're talking about deglobalization, last year we had the slowest rate of increase in global trade and goods and services that we've had in the last 50 years. So we are talking about a huge reduction in global trade that's upon us. And I think it all comes down to ideas, because the 5 pillars of prosperity that I just listed are kind of out, and people have gotten this idea that the state is in, and the state is going to be allocating capital. Industrial policy is now the new mantra in the United States, and we've never had this industrial policy, or what I call state capitalism, in the United States before. We've never had that model. And it came in 2001, really officially. And it means that the state is going to be allocating much more capital and be restricting trade and so forth and so on. And just think about sanctions. Since 2021, sanctions have been imposed, a 900% increase in sanctions that are being imposed by the United States. Now, that's just a form of protectionism. That's the same as a quota. It's the same as a non-tariff barrier. It's the same as a tariff. They're all forms of protectionism, and the public is pretty much bought into this. I mean, they go along with the sanctions. Why do you think the politicians are doing it? They get by with it, and they're popular. And things now, we're faced with what, 100% tariffs proposed on EVs and solar panels coming from China. So I think it's a change in ideas that the whole concept is changed dramatically since the years of, in particular, Thatcher and Reagan, but also just the whole basis of Hong Kong. I mean, you've been living in Hong Kong. You've had the 5 pillars. Why do you think Hong Kong's so prosperous? And when you think about industrial policy, the big problem in this is you're giving the decision-making nexus into the bureaucracy. And once you do that, people are making decisions about allocating capital, and they're doing so without having to face the penalties and cost associated with making bad decisions. In the private sector, in the profit and loss system, you know very well what happens. You go broke if you make too many bad decisions.
Professor Hanke, I wonder if we could talk on a more granular level for a minute, as we did in our conversation. And you talk about the state allocating capital. Should we talk about the state misallocating capital? And let's use the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. Do you see these things as giving the wrong incentives? And we were talking about, for example, TSMC locating its semiconductors in Arizona, the most arid state in the US. Could you talk a bit about specific things that we've seen in, the administration in Washington enacting, and how you see the consequences, whether it's the Chip and Science Act or the Inflation Reduction Act?
Okay, first let's go to the reason for this huge increase, I think, and it's the arithmetic behind the huge increase in government intervention and industrial policy and the subsidies in these various acts that you've mentioned, Henny, is the green climate mandates. And once you have a mandate, we are estimating on an international basis, McKinsey has done this, that by 2030, there'll have to be roughly $55 trillion of capital allocated into green and green technologies. And the production of green will be only profitable for about 25% of that. So 75%, 3/4 of it, will have to be produced by enterprises that can't make a profit by engaging in those activities, those green activities. So that means, again, the arithmetic is that the state will have to subsidize a lot of this. And then we're getting into the granular issue of Arizona. So we've got these chip factories going in there, and you've got TSMC with about $6 billion in subsidies going into them for 3 fab units. You've got $8.5 billion going into Intel for 2 fabs and the renovation of another. And where are they located? They're located in Arizona. That happens to be an arid state. It's dependent on the Colorado River and the Green River for water sources, and there's a so-called shortage. Now, why is there a shortage? Because the state allocates the water. There isn't a water market. There aren't private property rights in the water as we normally think of it in the Colorado River Basin. It's allocated by the state, and most of the water is actually allocated for agriculture, very, very little for non-agricultural purposes. And as a result, right now, we have a water shortage. There are suburbs in Phoenix that they stopped development of home building because they don't have any water. But yet you're putting these high water use industries and locating them there. And the question is, well, where are they going to get the water? This is a big political problem because it's decided politically and bureaucratically. If it was a market, of course, there wouldn't be a shortage. The price would clear the market, whatever the demand and supply of water happened to be. If you had a market and private property and the water rights, the market would clear whatever the equilibrium price happened to be. Part of the problem, by the way, with the allocation of water in the Colorado River Basin, it's priced too low. It's allocated bureaucratically and politically, and it's priced too low, and as a result, you've got a shortage.
I'm going to ask you a kind of tricky question. Earlier on, and you were kind enough to join us when it's so late your time, we heard Iñaki's remarks about how both governments and private sector can be too short term. So therefore you have problems allocating capital for problems that are really long term. And yet what we see in the States is massive capital misallocation, distorted incentives, all from mispricing. How do we go forward? What is your recommendation in a world where government... Sorry, I'll let you go on.
I think, Henny, it gets back to the original thing that I was talking about. It's ideas. We have to somehow change people's ideas and get them back to the 5 pillars of prosperity and thinking about free markets and thinking about, by the way, the performance of state capitalism. That hasn't worked out very well wherever it's been tried, by the way. Yes, you do have some examples of things that were worked out. But in general, we find the following. You've got the iron law of state capitalism, and that is over budget, over time, under benefits, over and over again. That's the iron law of state capitalism.
Thank you very much. Iñaki, do you have a question for Professor Hanke?
I guess if we think about reversing the current situation, it's a multi-complex problem. You have so many dimensions that you need to take into consideration. I do think that we have a problem where the current model is under question by certain countries, and I think you have a young part of the population that today is questioning the way things have been done in the past. So when you talk about these 5 pillars, do you think that they will resonate with the TikTok generation?
Excellent question.
I think the answer to that is yes, but there is a big problem with in general the media. Hanke's rule is a 95% rule when it comes to the media. 95% of whatever you're reading in the media is either wrong or irrelevant, and it gets into what's called Gresham's law of talk. Bad talk drives out good talk. That's our problem. We have to figure out how to overcome Gresham's law of talk.
Time to move on, I think.
And get the message across. Why it's a fairly, I said exhibit number 1 is Hong Kong. Why has Hong Kong been so prosperous? They pretty much stuck with the 5 pillars. And why have any, if you drill down, any of the Asian tigers, why really were they successful? I think that they were successful because there was a heavy reliance on the 5 pillars, and the ones that didn't rely on it didn't do very well.
I'm going to interrupt you there because we're running out of time. We have less than 10 minutes. I want to thank you so much for staying up with us, Professor Hanke. And now I'll turn to Professor Xu. You know, we're in a world today where emerging markets are more than 50% of the global economy, and China is, to some extent, the spokesperson for what we call the global south or emerging markets. In this world, how did China and Hong Kong navigate? And what is your impression of Hong Kong's relations with its neighbors and how we can become closer to them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Mr. Nijina, and Your Excellency Professor Yang Jiechi, very good morning, distinguished guests and dear friends. It's my great honor for me to attend this summit and together with you in this beautiful and prosperous season in Hong Kong. Actually, I have a presentation, so you can look at the presentation about my topic about, before I answer your question, maybe I will talk about my presentation. Yeah, okay. I will, okay. Maybe I talk about the 4 points. And the first point about China view about the globalization and the de-globalisation. The second about the role and position of ASEAN in the trend of globalization. The third about the Belt and Road Initiative able to show is a distinct advantage. The last one, the role of Hong Kong in the new globalization, especially in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, okay, no problem. So I think, according to the China, I think how to understand the globalization So we maybe we have three. We think globalization is about the three modernization, namely economic globalization, political polarization, and culture diversification. This is I think this is a position from China about democracy, globalization, and then how to thinking about how to understand the de-globalization, maybe about the three aspects. The first, the flow of words around the world has caused more unbalanced distribution, especially in the gap between the rich and the poor among the various countries. The second, the global governance has encountered profound institutional obstacles. The most important thing is that the institutional arrangement for the distribution of the global wealth has become more unfair. The third, the globalization promotes the translation in movement of culture, information, and people, brings a representative challenge to nation countries. And this is about the meaning of the de-globalization. So how we can see the role the ASEAN in the trend of globalization. I think the ASEAN as an active playing in globalization, I think more and more is very important, because I think ASEAN now become the new impetus of the economic increase in globally. So the ASEAN as a part of the global south, I think more and more played active player. You can see by participating in the national organization, promoting initiative, and advocating multilateralism, ASEAN countries are driven to issue the international rules are more aligned with the needs of the global diversity and the international order, compared to reflect interests and concern of all the countries. So this is the role of the position of the ASEAN. And then the third one about the new globalization, I think the Belt and Road Initiative can show its distinct advantage. Because the BRI proposal and promoted by China has emerged as a significant public good, with the potential enhance globalization and the reform of the global governance system. And then the Belt and Road Initiative as well to foster greater participation, gain, and happiness among the majority of 1,000 countries globally. And the last one about the role of Hong Kong in working with the ASEAN and joint build and road. I think Hong Kong have a key role in working with the ASEAN in the Belt and Road Initiative. I think Hong Kong have the full advantage. One is a geography advantage, especially Hong Kong Street location. First is a unique position as a gateway between China and ASEAN. This is exempted by a role in facilitating hardware facility connectivity between the two regions. For example, maritime connectivity is a notable example. The second is Hong Kong's tenant pool. Tenant pool is a significant asset comprising individuals with a deep understanding of the international norms and practice. This tenant pool serves as a valuable resources for China and ASEAN in their efforts to promote the Belt and Road Initiative. One advantage of Hong Kong is that it serves as the center of cultural exchange between the East and the West. This advantage can be leveraged to promote understanding between China and the ASEAN in terms of religion, culture, and other aspects, and enhance people-to-people connectivity between China and ASEAN. I answer your questions. And another advantage in that Hong Kong is an international financial center. This position can be exploited to promote financial integration, green financial development, and sustainable development in ASEAN infrastructure development. Furthermore, I think the development of a headquarters economy necessitates the implementation of the measures to facilitate Chinese enterprises in establishing ASEAN investment
I'm going to cut
headquarters
you off
in
there,
Hong Kong.
Okay. I'm going to ask Eric one question, and that is, Eric, are you piggybacking on your Chinese companies as they go into ASEAN? Briefly, and then
Yes.
we're at a time end.
Yes, we have these new alternative energy companies, manufacturing technology companies, biotech. All of these companies are globalizing. So I want to come back to your original question. Can we reverse deglobalization?
Yeah.
I don't think we should, because we can't go back. We got to go forward. So what we're going through is deglobalization. When you get through that, and then how do we re-globalize? And the re-globalized world will be very different from the last globalized world.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I want to thank you all. Sorry that we didn't have more discussion across each other, but it's been a privilege for me to be here today, and I'm more proud than ever. When people ask me where I'm from, I say Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you.